coming on a wet day in Melbourne. Can I also add my acknowledgement of the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. You will hear a bit from Mariana today about missions, and I think Australia has no more important mission perhaps than to ensure that we recognise the Uluru Statement from the Heart in a way that empowers all Australians from first to last. My name's Trav McLeod. I'm very fortunate to lead the Centre for Policy Development and to be hosting Professor Mazzucato this week. I must admit, when we invited Mariana to Australia, we promised sunshine, seafood and swimming. We did not promise the torrential rain or flash flooding. But I assured her on the way here that Melbourne was not like Sydney and there would be a full turnout despite the inclement weather, and given that all of the seats are packed, you've definitely demonstrated that, so thank you very much for coming. We're in a special place here, the Wheeler Centre, and of course its founders, Maureen and Tony Wheeler, who are central to its beginning and were its patrons, have also been very valuable supporters of the Centre for Policy Development. They have a love of books, travel through the lonely planet and ideas, and Mariana has those in spades. I'm sure they would agree that there would be no better Christmas present than The Entrepreneurial State or The Value of Everything. You've probably already got a couple of those books on the way in, but if not, please do grab one on the way out. You're all distinguished guests, but there are a number of supporters of CPD here, and I'd just like to thank them for allowing us to do what we do, to create, connect and convince on some of the big policy missions facing Australia and the region, whether they be about better employment services, sustainable finance and taking on climate change, helping refugees and asylum seekers in the region, to renewing Australia's democracy. It's very appropriate, as Jackie said, that this event is taking place within a city, because some of our best work has been with local governments, including the city of Wyndham, who are here today, one of the fastest growing parts of Victoria. Those of you that heard the radio this morning may have heard that the words Canberra bubble were named today as the 2018 Word of the Year by the Australian National Dictionary Centre. I'm not sure how it's possible for two words to be Word of the Year, but there you go. And of course it's about the frustration with navel gazing, as they described it in Canberra. And that's why doing this event and looking not just at the missions framework, but what it means for cities as drivers of transformations, drivers of moonshots, is particularly important. What is Australia's mission? What's our moonshot? What's the role of subnational actors like cities in getting us there? That's the sort of discussion that Mariana will kick off in just a moment. After that, she has a brilliant panel. Glyn Davis, who will be in the driver's seat this afternoon, was on the other side on Tuesday night in Sydney, where Laura Tingle was asking the questions. But with John Thwaites, Sarah Pearson and Glyn Davis, I'm sure we'll have a fascinating conversation about all the aspects of the issues that Mariana raises. A few words on Mariana before she starts, because she's already been introduced to some extent by Jackie. Her books, The Entrepreneurial State, Rethinking Capitalism, which she co-edited with Michael Jacobs, The Value of Everything, they're enormously influential around the world at the moment. They talk about not just the role of public policy in opening up new missions, but the importance of not just thinking about growth, but the direction of growth within a society. She is, as was said, the founder and director of the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. She's been described as the scariest economist in the world by 7:30 on Monday night as an economic rock star. Her work has been influential for governments and institutions of all persuasions, of all political colours. The European Union has just committed $100 billion to the sorts of mission-driven innovation framework that Mariana's work has introduced. She's won numerous prizes around the world in different countries. But one acknowledgement, I suppose, that we should mention in this city is that just on the weekend, Bloomberg released its top 50 list of people to watch. Mariana was on that list as someone to watch. And of course, we're already admirers of her work because of how closely it matches with what CPD is about. The only Australian on that list was Ken Hayne, the Royal Commissioner into the banks, which, think about that for a moment. Quite uniquely, Mariana's work speaks to not just the future of government, but the future of business and finance and how those worlds work together more effectively. She arrived in Sydney on Sunday. By 1 o'clock, she had walked from Bondi to Coogee and swum twice. I'm sorry to say that she's already been converted to the Sydney Swans by one of our board members. But she's been an absolute delight to have in Australia. We've loved having her here. And would you please give her a very warm Melbourne welcome?
Oh, wow, it filled up. When I was sitting there, you weren't there yet. So thank you so much to Travers and the whole CPD team, and to Jackie for welcoming me to your great city. And it was dangerous this morning because it was raining, and the only wind jacket I had was a nice red and white Sydney Swans jacket. And I don't know what it is, but I actually decided not to put it on. That was probably a good decision, right? Anyway, so because we have a limited amount of time, actually it's good, the timer's not going yet, so I'll have a longer time than they were planning for. I was actually going to focus on a subset of issues of those that I've actually been discussing with different people in Sydney and Melbourne today. And it's really about this whole question of how we can be ambitious around the full array of instruments that we have in the policy-making toolkit, from procurement policy to price schemes and grants and loans, to not just have handouts to the loudest who ask for the funds. And academics, by the way, are very loud. We get all sorts of funds as well, but especially in, say, the business community, there are sometimes certain sectors that are louder than others and might get some handouts, whether it's called industrial policy or something else. How can we actually use all these different instruments to focus on the real issues and societal challenges that we have at the city level, at the regional level, and at the national and international level? And what would that look like, literally, in terms of transforming the way we think of economics? How did that just go to 11 minutes? There's no way. I just spoke 4 minutes. Put it back up to 15. Right. So the talk is precisely this whole issue of growth doesn't just have a rate. It also has a direction. And that direction actually requires certain types of tools inside governments, inside those public agencies, but also in terms of how government interacts with all the other actors in the economy, which are co-creating what I call value. And that would include, of course, civil society organizations. I never stop saying, let's not forget also that trade unions in the history of capitalism have been absolutely central for co-shaping and co-creating markets to be more inclusive. So we wouldn't have weekends and the 8-hour workday without those struggles. And the Green movement itself, not just the Green Party, the Green movement has been central to shaping currently how we're thinking about green transition. So this is really about public, private, third sector, really thinking through the governance structures, but also how they interact and how those interactions can be focused more on concrete problems that need to be solved, and in doing so, stimulate lots of activity across the economy. And the first point is that this is the time to talk about it, because after I'm serious when I say I'm ignoring that. There's no way. I think this timer is going way too fast. It's already down to 9 minutes. Either I'm talking really fast or it's going. So it's a great time to talk about the direction of growth, because I think we have a widely recognized set of understanding that the type of growth that we had just leading up to the great financial crisis, the problem was not the lack of growth, but the type of growth. So the financial sector, for example, had stopped really fueling activity in the real economy. It had been basically just financing itself. So finance, insurance, and real estate. And the real economy itself, in industry, had become over-financialized. What we see across the world is an increasing trend towards financialization of business. So the Fortune 500 companies together over the last 10 years have spent $3 trillion worth just buying back their shares to boost stock prices and stock options and, surprise, surprise, executive pay. So this whole question of, well, how do we kind of reform that? How do we get a different type of growth that's more inclusive, more sustainable, so greener, but green really in terms of the whole economy, not just renewable energy, and more innovation and investment driven. That, by the way, is not a small point. Many economies, including the one where I just came from, the UK, continue to grow actually through consumption-led growth. And that consumption has been increasingly fueled by private debt, partly because real wages haven't risen in many parts of the world. So the only way that existing living standards can be retained is precisely by taking out that debt. So that's not a very good way to grow. By the way, there's an irony that after the crisis, many countries actually obsessed about the public debt and the deficit, when actually, if you just looked at the numbers, the real problem area was the private debt, and yet we're back at levels of debt, private debt to disposable income, that we had just before the crisis blew up. So that's the bad news. But the good news is there is this discussion, right, around the world about let's rethink growth. There's these 17 sustainable development goals that sometimes people make fun of them because they say, oh, it's just trendy talk, blah, blah, blah. But no, over 100 countries have signed up to them. They're incredibly ambitious. There's 169 targets underneath them. So it's, that didn't exist before we had those SDGs. We didn't have a consensus that those problems were there and that we had to tackle them. And there's also in some countries a comeback of industrial strategy, actually after having been basically a blasphemy for many different years. And so the problem is, and the thing that I've been trying to address across the world, is do we then actually have the tools to go after this? This is difficult stuff, inclusive growth, sustainable growth, innovation-led growth. How are we going to do it? How are we going to come together in different ways, collaborate in new ways, and in the policy-making process, do we literally have the toolbox to confront it? And I think the answer is no. And forget the big ideologies of the state versus the market. I'm talking about even in countries or regions or cities where we know public policy matters, the tools tend to be quite lame and boring. Just look at these words that are used all the time. It's important to level the playing field. For who? For the players to play. So the civil servants aren't going to play. They're just going to level the playing field. Set the rules of the game. De-risk. De-risk who? The risk takers in business, right? The value creators. Enable them, incentivize them, facilitate them. Just think of a marriage, like a couple, right? If one is facilitating the other, it's probably going to be a bit of an abusive marriage. It's not going to be a dynamic, sexy marriage. Fix things when they screw up, and they screw up a lot. The financial crisis was a big example of that. So fix market failures, or if you're a bit more interesting, you'll say fix system failures. But still, you're just fixing. You're in this constant mending mode. And even the central banks, which, regardless of what one thinks of them, they kind of save the capitalist system, just at least in a kind of static kind of way, in terms of the massive amount of trillions of dollars that were plugged into the system. Even they are seen as just being a lender of last resort, right? So, and when you actually look at the investments that have occurred in the history of capitalism that actually brought us some of the biggest innovations, we had an investor of first resort, not a lender of last resort role for public finance. And so the problem is that this constant fixing, bandaging up role is not just kind of false historically, and I'll go into that in just a minute, a bit more of that in terms of examples, but it also is constantly presenting to us this kind of false dichotomy of the really exciting, creative, funky, dynamic thinkers out of the boxers here, and the civil servants there. Again, in societies that support the state. I'm not talking about the Tea Party. So in an adult room like this, we sometimes go back to thinking of de-risking as though that's something interesting to say. And this, it's not surprising then that this also affects how we train civil servants. Literally the whole public choice theory, new public management toolbox that is used across the world to train civil servants actually kind of somehow has convinced them that government failure is even worse than market failure. So be careful, just always remain kind of, in the back seat, and yes, do your thing, but don't do too much, otherwise you're going to start crowding out a business, and don't pick winners, and don't make strategic choices. Again, just facilitate others to make those very interesting choices. And the problem is that, again, that would, is that right, is that wrong? Well, let's just look at history, and the history of technological change, which has actually driven changes in production, distribution, consumption, and productivity across the whole economy for the last 200 years. It'd be almost impossible to understand those changes if we just saw the policy process as just kind of fixing. And I'm not going to go into all these examples, but just to say everything in your smart products right now in your pockets, what makes them smart and not stupid, were things like the internet, GPS, touchscreen, and Siri, all outcomes of public investments in particular types of public institutions, that in the US, but today in the green economy, the green revolution that is happening across the world at different levels across different countries. You do have, for example, very ambitious also public banks in China in particular, the China Development Bank, the German Development Bank. They too have taken huge risks in actually supporting the high-risk, long-term kind of investments which the private financial sector not only tends to shy away from, but often then comes in afterwards, which is a good thing. You know, they get crowded in. But even that word, crowding in, it's supposed to be a good thing. It still sounds bad. You're crowding. We literally don't have the vocabulary. We don't have the narrative, the stories. First of all, the stories that let people even understand these facts, but then also in terms of thinking, how do we structure these public organizations? How might we also co-create value with these other types of actors that I mentioned in the beginning becomes really hard. And so if we can't even understand the basic kind of big technological shifts that are kind of easier to understand than the wicked kind of more social problems around inequality, health, and climate change, how the hell are we ever going to actually confront and tackle the extreme difficulties that we've signed up to with the Sustainable Development Goals? And so these two books that I have self-promotionally forced you to sell in the back there, tried to tackle that. One was much more on the investment side, so the investor first resort role, and much of that was actually telling the history of some big innovations that have happened, and then asking, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we could really kind of throw at the challenges that we have ahead, that full kind of systemic way of thinking of public policy across the whole innovation chain, basic research, applied research, the feedback between them, early stage patient finance, the use of procurement policy downstream to really welcome and crowd in new kind of bottom-up solutions to fuel innovations, for example, with the green transition. And the other one, which has just come out, was very much about, well, this might actually force us to rethink what we mean by economic value. And not just in the way that kind of feminists have also very importantly asked us to do so for many decades. You know, we don't even value care simply because it doesn't have a price. And we tend to have a strange way of thinking of value in economics where we only kind of value things with prices. So if you marry your cleaner, GDP goes down, and if you pollute, GDP goes up. I'll let you think about why that is later when you're doing your Sudoku. But also literally the process to create value. If we really understand the public sector as co-creating value, of course business creates value. We know that. That's why they're so confident when they talk about these things, the wealth creators, but also civil society organizations. And then within each one of them, how do we govern those structures? You know, just think of those great courses that people take with MBAs, strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior, that same kind of strategic consciousness, decision-making process should be how we also govern state institutions, but also how we, create these healthy, dynamic, symbiotic, mutualistic partnerships and ecosystems, and not sometimes these bit parasitic ones that unfortunately we've set up in areas like the pharmaceutical industry, where of course the public sector has played a great role, but then somehow the taxpayer pays once, twice, 3 times for drugs that they actually help to co-fund. Anyway, so what I want to do in the last, it says 4 minutes, but I'm sure it's at least 5, is just to go through, this kind of very practical tool that I've been working on for the last year. And I kind of brought it to the European Commission. And even though, these books are great, they sell, people talk about them, you get on these random lists and random prizes, but this became law. That's kind of cool. It became part of the legal framework of the European Commission. They actually voted on it in Parliament and the Council. I was like, oh my God, I better watch out what I write next time, because I was like, kind of wrote that in a rush. I'm kidding. It was very well thought out. But shouldn't admit these things. Don't tweet that part. Just tweet the ambition. So the idea was that in the same way that industrial strategy at the national level and innovation policy at the national level, unfortunately, has sometimes been not ambitious enough and has just ended up, again, worrying about the size of companies, like SME policy, which I've never really understood, because most SMEs, well, I won't go into SME bashing because that's not my interest at all, but lots of small and medium enterprises maybe aren't interested in innovating, aren't even that productive, don't even treat their workers very well, but we somehow just think that because they're small, they need particular types of support, versus, for example, looking at particular characteristics of particular types of SMEs, which might require particular types of support. And in fact, only about 6% of them in Europe are even thinking about innovating. So we might want to support them just because of their size, but do that not through economic policy. If you want to do it through innovation policy and economic policy, it would actually require looking at much more granular characteristics of those companies, but also, again, at the sectoral level, too much of our industrial policy in the past has ended up just kind of handing out money, whether it's to life sciences or more traditional industries, without really having an ask. So the idea was, let's think in a moonshot way. And why? Not just because the moonshot makes you sound interesting and dynamic, but think about it. Getting to the moon first of all, it's really concrete. They got there and back again in a generation. That's how it was framed. And you can actually answer, did you get there or not? So forget that many people in this era of denying that experts have anything to say, or even saying we never got there, right? That's unfortunately the trend that we're certain, well, anyway, skeptics about science, unfortunately, is the big thing that we should also be combating. But assuming you all believe we got there, what got us there was lots of different sectors investing and innovating. It was not just aeronautics. There was also lots of activities in textiles, in nutrition. You couldn't get to the moon in jeans and a t-shirt while you were eating a hamburger. I'm sure you knew that without reading the history of the moonshot. But also lots of the government instruments, the ones I even mentioned before, procurement and prize schemes, were actually critical to driving through the bottom-up solutions that, again, got us there. And lots of those solutions are precisely those that I mentioned before, or in your iPhones, but also lots of things failed. The trial and error got us there. So that willingness to experiment, to welcome uncertainty and exploration was also really critical inside the public sector and how it interacted with the other actors in the economy. But the challenge was greater than the moonshot. The challenge was basically Sputnik and the space race and the US wanting to beat the Russians. So what would it look like if we actually used that same kind of ambition, inspirational kind of a concrete target to address those SDGs that I mentioned before, that we actually really need a roadmap towards? And they will each have their own context, be different in different countries, but also at the city level. Cities are really interesting places where to experiment with what would it look like to think about the future of mobility and a fully accessible system of mobility in terms of disabilities. All the different innovation that you would require across the city, across a country to get there, and how to use the different levers to really welcome in that bottom-up experimentation. Because we know top-down doesn't work. That was the Soviet system, but we also know that bottom-up kind of creates chaos. So the idea in the report was just to start playing with this. So, climate change, that's the big challenge, but what would it look like? And the exact missions here are just the ones that then we negotiated that were allowed to go into the report. I'll just say that the ones I thought of were actually even more ambitious. But anyway, this is still very nice. 100 carbon-neutral cities by 2030, reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions on balance of 100 European cities by 2030. And again, all the different sectors that would have to be involved in terms of real estate, energy, construction, environment, behavioral changes, of course, thinking about mobility, food, social sectors, and then again, just all the different projects, the 200, 300 different projects that might have to be fueled through the different levers that we have. So, of course, buildings with carbon-absorbing components, clean urban electric mobility, citizen carbon ID cards. Same thing with clean oceans. It's not enough to say clean up the ocean. What would it actually look like in terms of innovation and industrial policy, but also at an international level for this one, to get the plastic out? And if you haven't seen Attenborough's Great Blue Planet series with that last episode on this problem, do watch it. But what would it look like to not get depressed by that, but to turn it into what to do and to really frame innovation and industrial policy and the levers to be conditional upon actually investing in these areas. That's why I often say, instead of picking winners, pick the willing. Who's willing? This stuff is difficult. That's why I don't like the word facilitating. Let's admit it's going to be difficult. We're going to take on these difficulties and risks together and really then devise our policies like that. Anyway, I'm not going to go through this, but this isn't easy. But that first thing of make sure that we actually devise missions that are bold and inspirational. And instead of that kind of top-down Kennedy moment, where it was Kennedy and his guys who kind of framed it, what would it look like to really have engagement in civil society to frame those missions in the first place? In Germany, this has happened recent years with the Energiewende policy, which has been about lowering the material content across its entire manufacturing base. And there it was really important, again, that the green movement over many decades actually brought that inspirational goal to the table, and that required struggle and conflict. We shouldn't forget that conflict has often been part of a process that got us great things. And this whole cross-sectoral, cross-actor, cross-disciplinary approach, and then using the full gamut of instruments for these bottom-up solutions. In the report, we also talk about all the challenges. This isn't easy, but let's think, once you start thinking this way, also being flexible and adaptable, and being able to think of the investments in terms of a real portfolio become very important. Just lastly, in the last 10 seconds, we've been working on this, as I already mentioned, in the UK, where the industrial strategy came out in November, and my institute actually had quite a bit of an effect in kind of forcing them to think about a challenge-oriented approach, and these are the challenges they came up with. But then Greg Clark, the Minister for Business, Environment, and Industrial Strategy, asked me to set up a commission for mission-oriented industrial strategy, where we've been working together with a large commission to actually break down, for example, the future of mobility challenge and mission into exactly this point of what would it look like if you had mobility as a service systems for urban and exurban environments, 100% accessible public transport system in terms of some of these bottom-up projects. But again, our point is not to feed through the projects. That really has to happen through stakeholder engagement, but to kind of help the government kind of have this new lens, a mission-oriented lens, where something as ambitious as having a sustainable, accessible, safe, healthy, and resilient form of mobility would require, again, investment, activity, innovation across sectors, as opposed to the increasing trend towards hoarding and financialization that I talked about before. Again, also clean and efficient buildings, both the new and the old buildings, but also the particular instruments. One work that we're doing right now in Scotland is that the public bank, which we helped Nicola Sturgeon set up, arguing that we need more patient finance, not inpatient finance. First thing, don't just make it a bank that is lending out patient finance to the loudest sector. Make it a mission-oriented bank, so patient, long-term committed capital is fueling different actors in the economy's ability to make those high-risk, long-term investments, and that's been very exciting to work with her. I don't have time to talk about this, but this whole issue of partnerships to make sure that they're mutualistic and symbiotic, not parasitic, really requires more confidence in the public sector to also ask for public return for the public investment. There's maybe some examples we can think about during the discussion. It requires a different way of talking, not de-risking, but welcoming uncertainty, not outsourcing, but capacity building, not picking winners, pick the willing, not fixing markets, co-creating and co-shaping them. This isn't just about discourse and narrative. It should eventually, hopefully, translate into a new set of economic tools and frameworks which also help us along the way, not just kind of talk about these big missions, but really get those more healthy deals that can, along the way, also make things exciting again, so we all look like the excited people that I put up there before on the left, and not the downtrodden, depressed bureaucrats, which unfortunately are literally under attack around the world in terms of not being seen as this wealth creator process. That's it.
Well, let me join you in thanking Mariana for the lecture, a wonderful sprint through some really important work. And the book, particularly The Value of Everything, I strongly recommend as a great, not just a provocation, but a really thoughtful piece about value and what it means. Let me also join in thanking the people who make this possible, the Melbourne City Council, Jackie and her team, the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and the Centre for Policy Development, because without you we wouldn't have the chance to come together today. And congratulate the audience, of course, for braving this completely typical tropical downpour that says we're on track for the climate. Can I welcome the panel? Dr. Sarah Pearson is the Chief Innovation Officer, the CXO, and the Chief Scientist for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. This is new territory. We've not had this role before, and I welcome you. Sarah, she's had an extensive career in public and private commercialisation of research. She holds a DPhil from Oxford in particle physics. And Professor John Thwaites, of course, well known to any Victorian audience, a former Deputy Premier, a long-serving minister and reformer with degrees in law and science. And I just want to congratulate John. He's one of those politicians who, on leaving Parliament, looks forward, not back. His whole view since leaving Parliament is about how can he change the world and what can he do. He's done fabulous work chairing the Monash Sustainable Development Institute and Climate Works Australia, but he's made new and significant contributions to water policy, to sustainability, and to corporate social responsibility. So welcome both. It's great. There's a huge amount we could discuss given the richness of Mariana's work, but I want to start with some questions about innovations. Then I want to think about how we measure productive work, because it's so important to her argument, and then think about what this means for indices like GDP before turning to those major policy challenges, the missions that she's just so eloquently described. Her fame comes in many ways from that original work about the role of the state in innovation. Her writing on how public investment shapes so much of what we call the market in private innovation has been profound. It's shaken policymakers. we've just heard a little about how the European Commission has taken it up, and also in the United Kingdom. But can you tell us what it takes in general for governments to recognise this role in innovation that you've described? How do you change the policy thinking within government to get some recognition that public investment matters?
So, thank you. Part of it, I think, is literally going almost on a marketing campaign. There's so little understanding in the population, and I think that's a failure of the politicians themselves to also talk about the success stories, but also, again, the risk-taking process along the way. But most Americans know about Solyndra, which was a failure. Government invested in it. Hardly anyone realized that Tesla received the exact same amount of money. And that's a failure of the kind of marketing side, but also failure of the portfolio side, if that's going to be the case, where you are going to take risks to fuel, a renewable energy transition and having to have a portfolio of different risky investments. Then how could it be that you ask the taxpayer just to take up the bill of the failure, this Solyndra one, and not kind of share in the success of the Tesla one? And I'm talking about downstream investments here. I would never ask, a policymaker to think about the equity and say a basic research kind of lab. But these are downstream investments going to the few companies willing to engage. So I think one of the things has been to really help them rethink the kind of inability and ask, why don't we tell these success stories? But then if we do, what's the next step? And another thing I think that's made it more appealing also to some conservative policymakers that I've also worked with is that it's not just about more money. It's about spending it more wisely. That kind of point I was making about the SMEs, there's in the UK £9 billion spent on SMEs, and that's not necessarily the best way to support those same SMEs that actually want to then innovate, because by the time you've spread all that money across the entire SME base, once it actually gets to the few that want to innovate, it's not enough. But also so many tax incentives, which in this country, for example, in Australia, you over-rely on the tax incentive schemes for R&D. That assumes that business already wants to innovate. But the evidence shows us that that actually produces very little additionality. In other words, investments that wouldn't have happened anyway. So the need for these more directed, mission-oriented strategic investments actually get businesses' appetite and expectations going about where the future opportunities lie. That tends to increase investment much more, and then you can use a tax incentive as a cherry on the cake. But it's more about going into these granular issues as opposed to just more public money, which isn't going to fly with most governments.
You're saying to the British Industry Department they should do things differently. How did you persuade them?
Well, you should ask them. But, it was interesting because both Vince Cable, who at the time was the Secretary of State for Business, and David Willits, who I now chair this commission with, who at the time was the Minister for Science under the coalition government, they were both kind of equally persuaded. And one ended up setting up the catapult centers and said that he had partly done it for the reasons of the entrepreneurial state. And then David Willits had his 8 Great Technologies platform, again, citing the entrepreneurial state. But even there, as an academic, I think it's always important not just to say, oh, isn't it great, I have impact. It's to say, but hold on a second. How did you do it? There's actually some problems there. So I think the problem is not just to have, that quick boom impact, but then to see the process through and make sure that we haven't sort of, lost sight of the key point. So the 8 Great Technologies platform, even though that was great because that was David Willits actually saying, look, we need public investment to get us the next wave of technological revolutions. Actually, the point of the missions is to say, well, be careful. You don't obsess about the technology. If we had obsessed about the internet as a thing in itself, it would have never happened. The internet was a solution to the problem, so focus on the problems. So, again, we should be careful not just to be satisfied with the sexy part of the argument, but also to be, constantly provoking and being a thorn in the side on the more uncomfortable parts.
Could I jump in and build on that? Because I absolutely agree. If you're going to drive any change process, which is what we're trying to do, you need to start with results. So quite often people promise results and say, let's change, versus actually saying this is what some of the results are. So absolutely, I'd really agree, Mariana, that we need to be telling the stories of the good things that we're doing so people can see the why. But I think to add to that, some sort of a shock needs to happen to a realization that we actually have to. So within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, one shock is that we are $2.5 billion short of meeting the SDGs. So we can't just carry on as normal. We have to do something different. So that's one shock. And then if you look at the economies in the Indo-Pacific, they're reaching some real shock points because they have been building their economies on manufacturing, and of course Industry 4.0 with artificial intelligence, robotics, etc., is looking to really paradigm shift all of that. So that's a massive shock. They cannot sit back and wait. They actually have to do it, and all of these things require energy, and the only way you really get energy is by going, oh, we have to do this. There is no alternative. It has to be done. And then it's and here's the example of something that worked and what it will mean for you.
So why did DFAT decide to have a CXO?
Well, especially for that reason, because there's $2.5 billion short in terms of meeting those SDGs, and realising that for decades we've been doing aid the same way. So how can we do aid a little bit differently? Okay. And innovation is obviously the answer to that. But now we've moved it across foreign policy, aid, trade, and the way we do business, because it's been working in aid. So now we're having it across all of our policy programmes. And then when you add to that the fact that if you look at our ambassadors around the world and they've obviously got relationships with the economies that they're in, and they're realising for us to be valuable partners as public services and as a whole country, we need to be understanding of their changes in terms of their economies, which is all based on innovation and science and technology.
Thank you. John, despite some politicians explaining why the Paris Agreement is not required, and of course enlightened commentary on commercial media, the challenge of climate change has in fact produced some rapid and major innovation. How central has public investment been to that, and how have we harnessed it into our responses?
Well, as you say, there have been a lot of bad news stories about climate in Australia, and certainly the lack of action overall is something that we really should be ashamed of. But there are some good stories, and one really good story is the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which I think is the largest green bank in the world. And what is interesting about that is a lender of first resort, as Mariana talked about. It's not a lender of last resort. It, as a bank, has gone out and started projects, started systems, including a huge auction tender for solar, which, because they were so large, because they were able to invest substantial public funds, they leveraged private money and private expertise, and the cost of those solar projects halved during that period. Yeah. And I think this is a great example of exactly what Mariana is talking about, where the public sector can lead, but not be on its own. Because it only has been successful because it has collaborated with the private sector. And I think part of the issue here is not having a dichotomy, public good, private bad, or the other way around. You've got to have both collaborating. And I think the Clean Energy Finance Corporation is a good example of that.
So has it avoided the trap that Mariana says so clearly in the entrepreneurial state and the Great Australian tradition of socialising the cost of research but privatising all the returns?
Well, it has been successful on that front too, because there's been a return to government. Yep. And it's less than a full commercial bank, but it is still a net return to government. And so it's been able to replenish the money. I think the Clean Energy Finance Corporation has now put out about $6 billion. It's leveraged twice that, $6 billion towards renewable energy. It's leveraged twice that in private money, and it's given a return to the taxpayer. Yeah. So, this is one example, I think, where smart, innovative tools can make a big difference.
I think also it talks about what value is. So, for instance, I'm thinking about the social impact area. We invest in entrepreneurs who are trying to solve food and nutrition issues around the world, for instance. And if from a pure venture capital investment perspective, you can talk about a return on investment on that startup, but we don't measure the return on investment to the public in terms of savings, in terms of the health systems. I think the social impact investment area is absolutely fascinating. We're heavily involved in that through, for instance, the Global Innovation Fund. But I think unless we actually look at the infrastructure around it, then we won't get the true value out of it, and we won't understand the true value either. So, there's even more value than you're talking about, because what about all the other savings that we don't measure, the flow-on effects?
Yeah, and let's turn to value, because that's a very big part of Mariana's work. You argue, Mariana, in detail about the way the inclusion of some sectors, such as finance, distorts GDP outcomes. And you just gave us a lovely example of the cleaner and what that does. We get a misleading sense of growth in cities. We get a misleading sense of decline. And you've pointed to some of the inherent challenges in measuring what productivity and what value might mean in our system. And again, it's the impact question. have you been able to change this conversation? Are policymakers listening and responding to the idea that they might measure value in different ways?
Just before I answer that, just to say it's really important what you both said, because it highlights the point that finance isn't neutral. Sometimes we think that money just kind of is, required for the wheels of commerce. Actually, what form of finance we use to fund innovation and the SDGs will affect what happens, and we should learn from the mistakes. So the venture capital sector is extremely short-termist. They want their returns in 3 years. They want to exit very quickly through an IPO or a buyout, and that really has created problems in the biotech sector, which we should learn from and not repeat in the clean tech sector, and now also in space, where the venture capital community is coming in. And it's not about VC good or bad. It's let's structure the financial system in order to really align with what we're trying to do in the innovation system, and especially when it really matters around the SDGs. Otherwise, we're going to find some problems along the way. So the point of the book was not to sort of bash a particular theory of value. It was to contest the fact that it's no longer debated. And it's amazing how the current framework that we have in economics, economic value being basically driven by preferences, and individual behavior, which is very different from how the classical economists and Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx were looking at objective, not subjective conditions of production. They focused on labor, the physiocrats on farm labor. It's not that that was the right way to do it, but it was very different when you're looking at the objective conditions of production, division of labor, productivity, and growth arising from that. It starts to make you look at different things than if you think that basically the price system itself and the exchange that occurs because of maximizing profits, maximizing utility, workers maximizing their choice between leisure and work. That whole kind of focus of modern day neoclassical economics on individual choices has also steered us away from looking at some of these more objective conditions, and has made it, and this is the point of the book, really easy for value extraction to pass for value creation. So the physiocrats and landlords in the 1700s who were extracting value, siphoning off money, funds from the farm labor towards just the landlord's rents, didn't pretend to be innovative. They weren't saying, oh, look at me, I'm so creative, and aren't I cool? They just said, give me the money. And that's why Adam Smith called them thieves. What we have today, unfortunately, is a really easy ability for people like, the CEO of Goldman Sachs 1 year after the crisis, Lloyd Blankfein, to, with a completely straight face, he wasn't trying to make anyone laugh, say Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world because of how we measure productivity. It's actually astounding that, forget kind of our big thinking around government. Government cannot actually accounting-wise show it's productive because many of its services are free, and since we don't have a price for them, we only include into GDP the costs. So the salaries of the teachers go into GDP, but not the value of a well-structured, ambitious education system, because there's different ways to structure education, or a healthcare system. So government can't kind of with the same confidence say, oh, we're so productive, we're the most productive in the world. Forget whether they want to. They just can't because of how we account for value. And so whereas the feminists and the environmental economists have for a long time made that case, because of those issues that I kind of quickly mentioned before, what we haven't had, I think, is a question of, are we sure that it's not just about adding things to GDP like well-being indicators, but do we even know what the difference is between profits and rents? Which was the critical, discussion between the classical economists. And currently, lots of what's passing for profitable activity as a result of actually investing and creating new high-quality goods and services is actually just moving stuff around, which the classical economists referred to rent as unearned income. Today, rent, even by people like Stiglitz, a very well-known economist, and I think he does great work, but even for someone like Stiglitz, rent is just a sort of transient situation towards a competitive price that gets impeded due to imperfect competition. And that itself is important because we start looking at things like monopoly power, but it doesn't actually help us also go and look at that unearned income. So there's some activities that are literally just moving things around and getting quite a big reward for doing so. And that would require not then blaming finance and the hedge funds and the credit default swaps as being value extracting and stop the conversation there. It's how can we really reform the financial sector so it's actually driving growth in the real economy and helping it steer also some of these challenges we have ahead, and that's difficult.
And Sarah, you mentioned the absence of social impact in value calculations, and most notoriously domestic work is not covered and not counted and valued, therefore. Tell us something about what you and your agencies are doing on this, and how do you represent this in international debates around what we measure?
Yeah, so firstly I'd like to say absolutely around the finance, we shouldn't just be going with the one model. So we have experimented with blended finance models, so making sure that you can give a grant or a loan or equity or even a whole mix of all of that. And I think that can really free up then what the outcomes that you're driving. We tend to be looking more at impact than value. So what impact are we having? Obviously with the SDGs, you want to have an impact. So that's something that we're trying to measure. It's not something that I think the public service has done a lot of. The public service tends to measure, did we do what we said we would do? And I'm sure there's all sorts of reasons for that. But we actually really need to be able to measure impact. So the Global Innovation Fund I mentioned earlier, they're one of the few entities that's actually doing this. So right up front before they invest, they will measure what they think the impact of an early stage idea will be, and then they measure it along the way to see whether it is actually delivering that impact, and if it isn't, then it will pivot. An example recently where early stage random control trials proved that this piece of work we were doing to give grants to seasonal workers to go to cities when it wasn't the working season in their region, it worked when it was small scale, but then we did the RCTs when we scaled it up and it wasn't working, so it needed to change. So I think the important thing is to keep measuring it too, so that you can actually change as needed. That agility, I think, in government is not something we're that good at, so this measurement and along the way is really important.
Thank you for that. John, you chair the National Sustainable Development Council, which recently produced a report on Australia's progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals, and you know, of course, about the work being done by Fiona Stanley and Mike Salvaris and others on developing an Australian national data index so that SDG scorecards can play into our measures of value. Tell us about this work and where it's going to take us.
Yeah, well, Mariana talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, and of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as being agreed by all countries, including Australia, they're not just a set of goals, they're also measures and indicators that we can assess our progress over time. In Australia, if we're going to achieve the goals, we've got to measure our progress. And so our National Sustainable Development Council, working with Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and a number of experts from around the country assessed against some 144 indicators how well is Australia going. And the outcome was really interesting because in some areas we're going incredibly well. I mean, we should look at the positives as well. In health, Australia in many areas is leading the world. Just in the last 15 years, our life expectancy has increased by nearly 3 years. Traffic accident deaths have plummeted, even in the last 15 years. So we should learn from that. In education, I mean, obviously an area, Glyn, you've been very involved in, the statistic that shocked me more than any out of our finding was if you look at the working age population, that's 25 to 65 in Australia, the proportion that have a degree or vocational qualification, I think, has increased from about 28% to 43%. That's right.
Yeah.
In 15 years.
Yeah. And a majority now have some post-school education, which is...
Now, the reason for that was a mission that actually governments, and in fact Labor governments, undertook in the 80s to have all kids finish school. Yeah. And so it's just changed the whole structure of our working population. But in other areas, our work shows we're doing really poorly, and most notoriously in climate, where our emissions per head are world-beating. And the area that a lot of people don't think about is if you don't look just on our impact in Australia, but what about the impact on the rest of the world? Our per capita emissions for the coal we export are about 44 tonnes per head. Yeah. Right? So it's more than the Middle Eastern countries. So, what this shows is that we've got some incredible achievements, but we've also got some incredible challenges. And what we would argue is we've got to learn the lessons of the achievements and address them through missions to address our challenges.
Fantastic. And let's talk then about missions, because that's a really great way to wrap up. Mariana, you've given us a couple of fabulous examples toward the close of some of the work you've been doing. Can you talk about that last slide, which you touched on, which had the constraints and difficulties, how you secure legitimacy, how you find evidence, how you deal with dislocation, that follows from this, and perhaps reflect on some of the successes, or at least some of the programs you're seeing emerge, and what we might learn from those.
Okay. So just to continue, answer that question, but through this, what we just said, one of the biggest problems is actually through the economic evaluation of it. So one of the things that we've been doing is working with the Treasury, so the Ministry, do you call it here the Treasury? Same thing, yeah. Everyone calls it something different.
When we're being polite.
On whether in the UK it's called the Green Book, it's the way that the government evaluates public investments, on whether the net present value and kind of cost-benefit type analyses would basically kill any mission from the start. And the answer is yes. And when I speak to them, though, they say, but hold on a second, actually, there's 3 different cases that basically come to us. One is the strategic case, one is the economic case, one is the financial case. And actually the Green Book and the net present value kind of measures weren't really meant for the strategic case. So it's actually been misused. That's actually been told to me by some Treasury people. So, and that's really good, actually, admitting that, because that starts to make us kind of realize, really, missions is how you should win elections. We should have politicians, actually running on these kinds of campaigns. And it's very interesting that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a very young Democrat in the US that just won the New York 4th congressional seat, she very much ran on the Green New Deal, right? And so I think we should remember that, that's what democracy is for. We should be, politicians should be kind of winning the vote based on these ambitious kind of goals. And then how to do it once you're elected, of course, will require kind of getting busy on the kind of hard stuff. But what's quite striking is sometimes when the politicians themselves aren't rising up to the challenge. And what's really interesting in terms of just getting that national debate. And it's interesting, though, in Australia, from what I understand, I don't know if I've been misinformed, but you have a really interesting national debate on this. The people, and even some students, I heard the 14-year-old is also leading the way, are actually asking for climate action. And so that's a great place to start with these missions, because actually how you frame them, I mentioned getting also real stakeholder engagement in framing them, so it's not just kind of the pet project of a minister who wants to be remembered at the end of his or her election or electoral period as having been the one who got us to the moon. How do you really engage with different parts of civil society? So, for example, the mission around care, it would be crazy not to involve the nurses at the table or caring workers at the table, who have also been struggling, especially in terms of how they're paid, but also have sort of frontline experience of maybe how we should build a more caring infrastructure, the social infrastructure actually required to have a more caring economy. They must be at the table when we frame those missions. And that's one of the hardest things, because that requires in the political process and the policymaking process, the art of listening. And none of us are really good at that. Academics, we're blah, blah, blah. We don't listen too much. But definitely, policymakers don't necessarily go through, a class of Empathy 101. And that is important, because that will be critical to making sure also that these things are resilient, that they last beyond a cycle. But another thing is this whole issue of flexibility and adaptability. If you look at the organizations that have been really good at kind of that mission setting, like DARPA in the US and the Department of Defense that basically finance the internet, one of its things is it's really flexible, it's adaptable, which means it also knows when to turn the tap off. It's not just about turning the tap on. You have to also have different metrics and targets, of course, long-term ones, but quite, nimble to also know, hey, this isn't working, let's go a different way, let's pivot. And that's hard, but that requires capabilities and capacities within the public sector, which due to this massive outsourcing craze that really we see all over the world, outsourcing to consultancies. I mentioned the other day, Brexit is currently being run by 4 consulting companies, basically, because of how much the civil service has been decimated. I'll remind you that David Cameron, his first week in office, apparently in 2010, he said civil servants are the enemies of enterprise. He was trying to say that in terms of showing how business-friendly he was, and I often say, now the chickens have come home to roost, haven't they? Given that you got one of the biggest civil service challenges and you've just kind of depressed them all. So this shouldn't be not highlighted. It is huge, the issue of how do we bring back capabilities, capacity, but also confidence and inspiration, ability to dream within the public service in order to be, again, a dynamic partner in all this. Of course, it's not just about the state.
I absolutely agree with that. And one way of doing that is actually to collaborate, to collaborate with exciting innovators, because then actually their culture, their enthusiasm and passion leaks into and seeps into the public service. We're certainly finding that. And to build on your point about public service needing to listen, I think absolutely listen, collaborate, but also empower. Because your point about sustainability, unless people on the ground are actually driving the change, there will be no sustainable change. I mean, we're finding this in terms of, one of our big, hairy, audacious goals is to build the innovation infrastructure within the Indo-Pacific so that people can solve their own challenges, their own social challenges. And, you should check out our video. We've got these awesome entrepreneurs that are going, fantastic, you're not coming in here and telling us what to do because we know what to do. And we just want to be a little bit of help to do what needs to be done. And just leveraging that passion and commitment to solve these challenges, I think, is really important for sustainability. And for a public servant, that's very different to how public service normally works, which is go in, here's a program, let's run it. It's okay, there's a problem. How do you reckon we could solve this problem? Let's see how we do this together. You do this bit, we do this bit, and let's drive an impact. But that is changing.
Can I just disagree a bit? Because I totally agree with what you just said, but it can be misinterpreted. It can be interpreted in terms of enabling and facilitating.
Yeah.
And that is disempowering from the public.
Yeah.
So how to do exactly what you said, which I would
As a
definitely
partner,
agree,
yeah.
as well as, not instead of, also being bold and actually laying down some of the pathway, because, especially with green transitions, you can actually just see this with the database. There's a Bloomberg New Energy Finance database, which literally, from an academic point of view, it's heaven because you can do great studies with it, but it has every single penny spent around the world on clean energy technology by the technology. There's lots of different types of renewables. Even within solar, there's like 10 different types. And what we see is exactly what we saw with nanotech and biotech, that the high risk, high capital intensive, really uncertain part has actually been invested on early stage by different types of public actors. And later, the private sector was willing to come in. So we shouldn't underestimate. It sort of depends which part of the entrepreneurial and business community you're talking about, but in so many different cases, business was willing to come in after some investments were made, and that ability to invest and to think in a portfolio way and willingness to take the risks and even to have the expertise within the public sector to do what CEFC does isn't exactly out there. And if we just use the enabling terminology, it doesn't get us that capacity.
Through the Global Innovation Fund, we've invested 30 million, and that's leveraged 150 million of private sector follow-on funding. So it's absolutely a model that that government is thinking about.
So let's throw this to John. As you think about both time in government and then time since, how do we take the large-scale transformations that Mariana and Sarah have talked about, and how do we achieve the behavioural change that has to underpin them?
Oh, well, that's two big questions, but look, part of the answer is collaboration and thinking and empathy. We can't do it the same way we've done it in the past. So if the big change is how do we move to net zero, or how do we have a sustainable food system, we can't just keep doing energy and transport and agriculture like we did before. We have to do it in a way, though, that gets all the players involved in the decision making. And the old way of government doing it was essentially you did get a consultant to come up with a paper, and then it all happened inside government, and then you're surprised why you didn't get a good result. I think it's about, at the decision-making time, bringing in the community, the academics and business, and co-producing the knowledge. And we're seeing some of that in water now. So one of my other roles is now Chair of Melbourne Water, where the water authorities, I think, do now increasingly work with academics and business, but very importantly the community in actual decision making about what we'll do, because the community have to pay for that. And for our prices, our water bills, if we're going to do something, people pay for it. So we have to ask people, are you prepared to pay for this?
Yeah.
And very often in terms of climate action, for example, they're saying, yes, we are, as long as we see something for our money.
Can I agree with that and then build on one of the points you made in your talk, which is around procurement? Because we've actually done that recently, brought a whole group of people together to work out what some of the gaps might be within the innovation ecosystems in the Indo-Pacific. And we had to do that with a procurement person in the room because it was so different to anything that had ever been done before by DFAT. And it was a great experience for the procurement team to learn how to do things differently, and they got a lot out of it. But you know what? The private sector within that room, they were challenged by it too. So there's a lot of change. There's a lot of characters that need to change. They were going, tell us what you want. Well, we don't know what we want. That's why we brought you here, to come and work out what we want. So it's not just the public service that's got to change. It's the whole ecosystem that needs changing.
Mariana, as a natural optimist, can we do this?
Can I just add one player, which we didn't mention? I was just before this meeting here talking to your trade union organization around the corner. And you should actually be applauded for this program that the trade unions have come up with, which is called the Just Transition. Right, so this is about the deals, the healthy deals, and workers and the labor movement, similar actually to the public sector in some ways, has faced big challenges around the world in terms of really retaining also bargaining power. They themselves should be changing. I personally think trade unions would be more effective if they were less on the defensive, more on the offensive, but to be honest, they have huge sort of challenges they're facing, and if we don't have investments in the workers who will actually be naturally transitioned out in those kind of dirtier sectors, then that's going to lead to less inclusion. And I think really having trade unions and different workers, representatives at the table in these discussions is not only key, but first of all, it's not really happening, to be honest. We seem to be easier getting civil society around the table than getting our capital-labor relations back at the center of how we renegotiate capitalism.
Thank you. Sadly, we are out of time, but would you join me in thanking Mariana, Sarah, and John? Audience knows that if you have a really complex problem with